The threat was already hiding in plain sight. Everything they needed to reach you was already public. Then came the breach, the extortion, the deepfakes, the failures. You're listening to The Lockdown, where we turn reconnaissance into the first line of defense. Here's your host, Ray Heffer.
Welcome back. This is episode 2 of season 2, recorded on July 27th, 2026. Now in today's show, it's all about cybersecurity. So we're going to start off there and then go into public and private keys, why that's important, especially for Proton users. And then I want to talk about passkeys. You may have noticed that there's more and more push from certain websites and services to get you using passkeys, but also how they came to be, the problem they are trying to solve, but the problem they also present to us and why I still hate them. We'll also talk about ClickFix malware. I've seen one out in the wild, so I'm going to cover that. And then we'll talk about VPNs are constantly getting blocked, but why that has pushed threat actors, the malicious user, onto residential proxies and how they hide in plain sight. So it's a packed show. Let's get started. Now we are in a very strange industry, aren't we? And I'm talking about cybersecurity. Here we are, protecting ourselves against people with malicious intent. Now, in some cases, we could be protecting an organization against ransomware groups such as Scattered Spider, for example. But I find it highly unlikely that the individuals behind these groups can do what they do because they possess a master's degree or perhaps 15 years experience in security engineering or some other tech job. The reality is, most of the time, they can do what they do because they've grown up in their bedroom as hackers, experimenting and seeing what they can learn. Now, this is certainly the case with Tyler Joubert and Owen Flowers. These are the two individuals that the NCA described as leading Scattered Spider members. Now, they were recently sentenced to 5 years in prison, or I think it was just over 5 years. But Owen got a cease and desist order for a minor cybercrime back in 2023. This was just after he turned 16. And by the time they were arrested, I think they were around 17 and 18. So the point is, they haven't had time to get 15 years experience in some security engineering job or go to university. Yet, if you look at any job posting for a chief information security officer or any security architect or engineering role, they seem to require at least a bachelor's degree and certainly 5, 6, maybe 10 plus years of experience depending on the role. You would think, wouldn't you, that if you're in cybersecurity, you should know the intricacies of how a ransomware attack is carried out from start to finish. And I don't just mean memorizing Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain or being familiar with NIST, because a CISO doesn't need to be capable of personally conducting an end-to-end ransomware operation. The role will involve business risk, identifying risk, mitigating risk, understanding of regulation, budget management, incident response and command, how to communicate with executives and so on. But a CISO who lacks a sufficiently detailed mental model of identity compromise or persistence, terms like lateral movement and how that's done, how data is exfiltrated, extortion and recovery, I think they start to become dependent on other people's interpretations. And I think the result of all of this is a potentially dangerous situation where some people, not everybody, but I'm just going to pick some, that have confused compliance with security. So thinking they're compliant means they're resistant to an actual attack. Now, I'm lucky enough in my day job to meet CISOs almost on a weekly basis, and sometimes at events, whether that be the RSA conference or a Gartner event, Black Hat that's coming up. I will have the chance to meet many of them in person, grab a coffee, have a few beers in the evening, that type of thing. And I'm noticing there are certainly many different types of persona for the CISO. You've got some that come from an audit and compliance background, and these folks are incredibly knowledgeable around GDPR, or perhaps they work in healthcare in the US, so they understand HIPAA. They've done plenty of SOC 2 audits. They've carried out an ISO 27001 audit through to certification. They've been there, they've done it, they know this stuff. Now, if you look at some of the job postings on LinkedIn, you'll find that for many companies, that's all they are looking for, is the understanding of compliance frameworks with a proven history of it. And it's no wonder then, is it, that these healthcare companies, or whoever they may be, in months, maybe a year's time, they're subject to a data breach or a ransomware attack, and they're another one of those companies in the headlines. To me, an effective CISO must combine several forms of competence. They certainly should have the operational experience. They need that conceptual understanding. They need sound judgment, and they absolutely need the ability to communicate, especially if they have to communicate with their board. Podcasts like my own, keynotes, all of this, they certainly amplify genuine expertise. But I've noticed in some cases, for some individuals, I won't name names, that this has concealed the absence of hands-on experience. Now, it's interesting because there's one podcast I was listening to, and it wasn't a cybersecurity podcast. I won't say what it was, but it was on YouTube and all the platforms you would expect, and it had, I'd say, 500,000 subscribers. It was very well known. And they had an individual on there that was introduced as the world's leading cybersecurity expert and the world's most dangerous hacker. Now, first off, I do have an issue with how the word hacker is used, but I'll save that for in a moment. The point was, this person was asked several questions throughout this hour-long interview. One of them, for example, was, should we use VPNs? Now, bear in mind, this was a general audience. It was not a cybersecurity podcast. So the host said, what VPN providers should we use? Is it a good idea to use them, and why? And this person's response was, yes, you should absolutely use VPNs, especially when you're in public places such as cafes and airports. And I thought, oh, great, so far, so good. Until he said, make sure you use US-based VPNs. And then when the host said, like what? He said, oh, such as OpenVPN and OpenSSL. Now, if you know anything about VPNs, they are not VPN providers. And I was baffled. I thought, why would he say that? This person he's got a background in cryptography and he's got a doctorate in cybersecurity. You must know the difference between a VPN provider and a protocol. And he even went on to say that around 90% of the population already have malware on their devices. And I don't think there's any substance to that at all. Now, I don't want to belittle anyone here. This person's done incredibly well for himself. But the biggest problem I have, the issue I take with this, is it's just misleading. In fact, one of the things he said while he was talking about VPNs was you can get free VPNs. Some of the paid ones are only $5 a month. Now, that statement on its own is incredibly dangerous. A free VPN, unless it's from Proton or someone more reputable, but many of the free ones, if you just go on and search for free VPNs now, they are not reputable at all, and I would not install them or recommend them. And this is the type of danger you have when these people have gained a public platform. They've got almost this influencer-like status. They're writing books, and sure, they're doing their research, so their books are probably pretty accurate. But the advice they're giving, I think, can be harmful. So I hope I don't fall into that category. I suppose I considered myself a hacker when I was a child, but let's describe what a hacker is, because I think that title, that word, has some grandiosity behind it too, doesn't it? I simply think a hacker is someone that's curious how things work, curious enough to take those things apart, whether that be a physical device or just code. And then they explore, how does it do it, and what can it do that it was never originally designed to do? Now, when I was around 8 years old, I got a Commodore 64 for my birthday. I loved this thing. It was actually my father's. It was a used one. I didn't care that it wasn't brand new. We didn't have a lot of money back then. But he gave me this thing, and it came with a bunch of tapes, and I started playing adventure games. But it wasn't before long when one particular adventure game, which was Lord of the Rings, crashed, and it just dumped out the code. It was just all written in BASIC. And I was like blown away. I thought, wow, I honestly felt like Neo from The Matrix seeing the code for the first time. Now, The Matrix didn't come out till 1999, but still, that's how I felt. But what that led to was this curiosity to how things work and why they work in a particular way. I remember one day my uncle, who was a TV and video, we're talking VHS and cathode ray tubes here, but he was a repair technician, and he came round to fix our VHS recorder. And he pressed eject, and the actual tape loader ejected from the top. It was a top loader, and it lifted up, and he put his fingers in there and released 2 clips and pulled it out. Now, I think I must have been 8 or 9 by this time. And I said, "How did you do that?" Now, quite rightly for him, he said, "I'm not going to tell you that," because obviously an 8 or 9-year-old that wants to take the VHS recorder apart is probably not a good idea. But I did figure it out. Once he'd left, after he'd repaired the thing, I put my fingers in there, felt around for some clips, and was able to replicate what he did, and I pulled the top loader out. I couldn't get it back in, but hey, that's a story for another day. But the point was, when I took that tray out, I saw the magnetic tape heads, I saw the shiny spindles, and I was just in wonder of this thing. And I suppose by the time I was around 12 years old, I think it was, I got an Atari ST. It was the ST FM. FM was for the frequency modulator, basically an RF port at the back to plug into a regular TV. Anyway, it was the 1024, so it had 1 meg of memory, and this thing was amazing. We're talking the mid-80s by this point. And I was at high school, or I should have been, but I did spend most of the time not going to high school because I wasn't learning anything. And I just didn't care for what they were trying to teach me. They didn't have a clue about computers, and I was going home and learning how to code. In fact, one of the things I started doing was learning how game cracks worked. So this is cracking the copyright protection of games. Now, if you grew up in the United Kingdom around the mid to late 80s, you may be familiar with some of the cracking groups. The names Pompey Pirates may ring a bell, the Medway Boys, Automation. And these were groups that not only cracked the games, but they'd put compilations together on 3.5-inch floppy disks. They would have a demo. So this was where my interest in the whole demo scene came about. Hence the ending of this podcast. If you're watching it on YouTube, the scrolling text is basically a nod to the demo scene. I was always fascinated with this. And that, in a nutshell, is how I consider the word hacker. Owen Flowers and Talaju Bear, the individuals behind Scattered Spider, and there are many more of them, but these are supposedly 2 of the leading individuals. Sure, they're probably hackers too, but I really just refer to them as threat actors. Yet, I go to these conferences, I look on YouTube, I read the books, and there are some people that are very good at putting on a performance. It's a song and dance. And I suppose the work they do, they certainly care about. And I suppose there's nothing wrong with that until they cross the line and start giving bad advice, such as use a free VPN. Now, hopefully that sets the scene for today's show, because I want to focus on cybersecurity for the majority of this episode. And I did say in the last episode that we are going to focus more on cyber. So here we are. And with that, let me introduce Kerckhoffs' principle. Now, it was Augusta Kerckhoff, who was a Dutch cryptographer, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, that said that your security should not depend on the secrecy of the system. And there was also an American polymath. He was a mathematician, a scientist, an engineer, and I'm sure many other things. His name was Claude Shannon, and he has something called Shannon's Maxim, which falls under this enemy knows the system umbrella. And he said one ought to design systems under the assumption that the enemy will immediately gain full familiarity with them. Now, if by any chance you are studying for the CISSP, which is the Certified Information Systems Security Professional by ISC, then you may want to just make a note of that, because I think it's in Domain 3, Security Engineering. It could come up in the exam. But let's apply it to something real. I recently had an email from a listener welcoming me back for season 2. So you know who you are. Thank you for your email. And I hope you're enjoying my responses. And I noticed he was attaching the public key for Proton. It's a Proton address. And he was attaching the public key as an attachment. Now, by the way, I forgot to enable that setting. So I've done it now. So if you go to Proton, go into settings, under encryption and keys, there's an option under external PGP settings to attach your public key. Any emails you send, by the way, Proton to Proton, are end-to-end encrypted. Now, I think this is a good opportunity to have a primer, a bit of an explainer on public and private keys. So in essence, you have a public key and a private key. And as the name suggests, the private key you keep private. It's absolutely not something you give to anybody. You guard it with your life. The public key, by name, by its nature, is public, which is why you can attach the public key to your Proton emails. But these two are derived mathematically, and basically it begins with this random number. It's a very carefully generated random number, but just for simplicity's sake, you begin with a random number. And this is part of what we call elliptic curve cryptography. So the private key is a very large random number, and the public key is calculated from that using this one-way mathematical operation. So if you got my public key, there's no way you can then work out what the private key is from that. It's one way. And calculating that public key is actually the easy part. So the two keys are entwined mathematically, so to speak. And the idea of it is that anyone can then use that public key to encrypt something for you, and then you can decrypt it with your private key that you hold dear to your life, or they can verify your signature, so it's proving it is who you say you are. Because only the possession of the private key allows for decryption or the creation of the signature itself. So I send you an email, I will create a signature using my private key, and then you can decrypt that, and then you use the public key to verify that or to decrypt the email. There are different systems, there's RSA, and these can generate these pairs differently, but the principle is the same either way. Now, I've probably butchered that to death. I'm not a cryptographer, but that's good enough for today's show. But what attaching your public key does in Proton is really it does two things. First, it gives the recipient the information they need to encrypt future messages that are addressed to you, so when they reply to you, for example, but also verify those digital signatures made by your private signing key. Now, if all this sounds far too complicated, just remember that Proton to Proton is automatically end-to-end encrypted because Proton retrieves the recipient's public key for you. You don't have to worry about that, it just does it. For an external recipient, perhaps Gmail or something, then attaching your public key lets an open PGP, pretty good privacy that means, capable client import it, and then they can subsequently send encrypted messages to you. If that's a step too far, don't worry about it. Just remember that Proton to Proton is automatically end-to-end encrypted, but this is what's going on behind the scenes. So there's a remaining problem though, and that's the authenticity of all of this, because an attacker could theoretically substitute another public key during that first contact. So what you have to do then is compare the fingerprint through an independent channel, could be verbally, could be in person, or through some other authenticated medium, that can then establish that both parties have the same key. Now, one of the things I have created on the website is a tool I've called Workbench. This is a nod to the Workbench desktop OS on the Commodore Amiga. I had an Amiga as well. I was a Commodore nerd. It wasn't just the Atari ST. So, has nothing to do with the Commodore Amiga, but hey, I've called it Workbench. And it is a large suite of ciphers, encodings, and analysis. So you can do things such as ROT13, which is rotating the alphabet by 13 spaces. You could type an input like hello Ray, and then the output would be in ROT13. Not very secure, but still good fun. And actually, there's a use case for things like ROT13 or using hex or any of these encoding operations to try and bypass some of the guardrails with AI. But that's probably for another show. But one of the things I've added there, two things. One is a PGP word list. And the other thing is the ability to take my public key, copy it into the text box, and then see what the fingerprint says. Now, you can do this from the command line. If you have Linux or Mac OS, this will work, and you want to make a note of this, I'll put it in the show notes as well, I suppose. It's the GPG command. So it's GPG --show -keys space -- with -fingerprint. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it, because that's why I've built the workbench feature of the website. Okay, now for this segment of the show, I am going to walk you through exporting your real public key from Proton Mail. Now, bear in mind, public and private key pairs, PGP, is not unique to Proton. It just so happens that that's what I use, that's what I recommend. And if you're not interested in learning about this, you can skip through this segment of the show. But I do encourage you to just listen along, even if you're not doing it. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to export that public key. We're going to read what's inside of it, find a fingerprint and turn that into spoken words. And then I'll show you how you can decode those words back to the fingerprint. And there's a hint, because at the very end of the show, you may well hear some words, and then you're going to know what to do with it. And the goal here is this whole key verification thing stops being some abstract ritual, and it will actually be something that you can do for yourself and learn how to do with your key and then other public keys as well. Now, I'll put links to all of this in the show notes, but if you go to the website psysecure.com, that's PSY secure.com /workbench, and you can also get to that from the resources menu. There's a link to Workbench in there. This is where all the magic happens. Now, I'm not going to walk through the whole thing because we would be here for hours. But there's two areas of focus, and you'll see on the left-hand side a whole list of operations, two of which are PGP key and PGP word list. So if you click on PGP key, you'll notice it has something filled in by default. It's just an example. That's basically what it looks like. There's an email in there. This is alice@openpgp.example. So it's just a nonsense email in there, but it shows you an example of what this will look like. You can click on the clear button at the bottom of those boxes, and then you are ready to paste your own key. Now, to do this, you need to head over to Proton. Go to settings, go to encryption and keys, and this is where we turned on the attach public key toggle switch earlier. And under that section, there is an email encryption keys section. And for each of the email addresses, for each of your identities or aliases in Proton, it creates this public and private key pair. Choose your default email, doesn't matter which one. We're not exporting any private keys in this walkthrough, only the public key. And you'll see there's an option to export public key. So if you click that, click export, save that on your machine, and then open it, you will see it starts with begin PGP public key block. And then at the end, you'll see there's the end tag in there. You want to copy that whole block, including the beginning and end sections. And then if you go back to the PsySecure website on Workbench, in the input box, paste your key. And what you should see, if this is copied and pasted correctly, on the right-hand side is the contents of that key. So you can see the algorithm. You can see when it was created, when it expires, which should be never in the case of Proton. You can see the fingerprint. That's the bit we're going to use in a moment, but there's key ID, there's user ID, there's a sub key. Lots of information in there beyond the scope of today's show, but the focus, the star of the show, is fingerprint. So if you copy that fingerprint, and it might wrap to the next line, so make sure you copy the whole thing, and then navigate on the left to PGP word list, clear what's in the box, paste that, and then you'll see on the right hand side, if this is copy and pasted correctly, you should see a bunch of words. They're in pairs. So in my case, and this is what you're going to hear at the end of the show, is island, intention, spearhead, getaway, tactics, Norwegian, and the list goes on. I won't read the whole thing now. You can wait to the end of the show for my own public key word list. You could give those words to somebody, or put them on your website, put them on your business card, wherever you like. And you can now take that word list, and using my Workbench page, you can do the reverse. So if you were just to clear that and copy those words first, clear that, and paste the words back into the output section, you'll see the input has basically resolved to your fingerprint again. And the reason for all of this is that the fingerprints would be quite challenging or miserable to read out over the phone. You'll be saying B is in Bravo. No, sorry, D is in Delta. The whole thing can mess up. If you get one wrong or mishear it, the whole thing dies. So back in the mid-90s, two people, Patrick Duola, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there, and Philip Zimmerman, solved this with this word list. There's 256 words, and they are all chosen to sound very different from each other. And it's one word per byte. And this is essentially how it works. And I think it's very cool and a bit of fun. But what you can also do, if you head over to keys.openpgp.org, you can search by email address or by fingerprint or even a key ID. Okay, I will leave it there because I'm probably giving away far too much information. But if you do enjoy the tool and you use it, let me know. I'll be curious to see how you get on with it. Now, moving on, I want to talk about passkeys. You may have noticed that more and more often now when you try and sign up for a website or you log in, it may be encouraging you to create a passkey. And basically what the passkey is a unique cryptographic credential that's created for that particular website. So when you register the passkey, your device, or it could be a password manager, whatever it is that's handling that, will need to generate a public and private key pair. So the website receives and stores the public key, while the private key remains under your control. Now, if you are using a MacBook, for example, by default, that private key will be managed through the iCloud keychain. And that's one of the reasons I have a problem with it, but I'll go into that in a moment. And that keychain is protected with your device password or your Touch ID. And it also has some hardware back security, such as the secure enclave. Now, you could use a YubiKey, for example. And with a YubiKey, the private key is generated and retained inside the YubiKey itself, which is a physical device. Personally, I would recommend using Bitwarden or KeePass XC. Now, I use KeePass XC because I use an offline password manager. But in either of those cases, it is stored inside the encrypted vault. And this is where if you use passkeys with KeePass, I would recommend having a separate vault just for the keys. Don't have them in the same vault as all your passwords. Now, the browser will usually act then as the intermediary between the website and then whatever device or method holds that credential. So let's just assume it's Bitwarden or KeePass for now. So you log in and the website will then send your device this newly generated random value called a challenge. And then whatever's storing your passkey, so KeePass, will combine that challenge with the information identifying the website and it will sign it using the private key. The signed response is then returned to the website and then it checks it against the public key because it's public and then you're granted a login. Now, what's interesting about passkeys is that a new challenge is used each time. So if you were to copy an old response, it would not work. It's useless. And that credential is also bound to the website's domain name. And the idea here is that a passkey registered, say, for google.com can't be requested or used by a phishing site such as Google with a 1LLL.com or some nonsense like that. Even if the fake page looks identical, that domain wouldn't match. Now, even in a DNS poisoning attack, for example, that's where someone basically points your machine's DNS lookup at a malicious hosts file or a malicious server, or you could even do this yourself by changing your local hosts file. So google.com resolves to a fake server, for example. But that's not going to work either. It shouldn't defeat a passkey because the malicious server still must present a TLS certificate valid for google.com. And I suppose a more advanced attacker, there's still a possibility they could relay a genuine challenge from Google and then through the malicious page and then have the user authorize the signature there and forward it back to Google. So it's not completely bulletproof. But I digress. The point of passkeys is it's using that same public and private key implementation and creating these new challenges, and there's no passwords involved. But this is where I do have a problem with it. First off, I think it shifts the burden back onto the user. For the company behind the website or the service, great, they don't store passwords. So if they had a data breach, there's nothing going on there. There's no hashes. You can't dehash it and find out what the password was because the passkey works in a different way. But this is where I say it's a problem onto the user, because for many people, let's say it's the iCloud keychain. Recovery of the keychain is dependent on getting a code on an Apple device. So let's say you have a spare device and it's unlocked and I get access to that device somewhere. It's another Apple device. I could reset that and it will send a code to that spare device, 6-digit code, and then I've just bypassed the whole thing. What's worse is there are many that still allow recovery with an email reset or, worse still, an SMS code, which is why I do not use a real SIM card registered in my name. And I've mentioned this many times in the previous season, but just to go over it again, I use a prepaid SIM card. Now for that, I recommend Tello or Mint. That prepaid SIM card is in an alias name, paid for with cash or a virtual credit card, whatever it may be. Now, I know for those of you in the UK or in Europe and other places, that's going to be more difficult to do. So if you have the regular cell phone plan, at least call the cell phone provider and disable porting. That's where someone can carry out a SIM swap attack. You'll need some second factor. They'll probably give you a PIN code or something along those lines. Depends on the carrier. But this is what we're protecting against, because if you have a real cell phone plan in your real name, and that's the phone number you use, which incidentally, most people, when they're employed, certainly in the US, will use their personal mobile phone number for work and personal. There's never an issued corporate device. I always used to have that when I worked in the UK, so perhaps this is just an American thing, but I think you should always have separation between your work and your personal phone numbers, which is why I use my pseudo. I have a virtual number for work and a virtual number for personal stuff. I keep them separate, but I never use the actual SIM number. But if you do, disable porting, and then at least you've got some mechanism of protection in there. And I think that's where the greatest threat comes from. It's from a SIM swap attack, which will then just bypass the passcode altogether with a reset. But here's the other problem I have with it. For the majority of people, you know the type of people I'm talking about. They have a MacBook, they use Google Chrome, they're using all the mainstream stuff. And I know plenty of people in cybersecurity that still do this. They're using Google Chrome, they're logged into Google, they're using the built-in password manager. And by the way, that will allow them to set up passkeys and it's linked to their Google account. So if I can recover their Google account, I get access to the passkeys. But worse still, I would never store passkeys or passwords or anything in the browser. I think it's just a ticking time bomb, but it's all your eggs in one basket, isn't it? I do not want passwords stored in my web browser. I have that separate in KeePass, or you may use Bitwarden. I certainly don't want passkeys stored in the browser either. It's very convenient, but this is why I say it's just shifting the burden from that company back to the user. And if they don't know what they're doing, and that account for Google or iCloud or whatever it is has got weak recovery options, then it undermines the whole thing. And I suppose this is another one of those topics where there's misinformation out there. There's a lot of people pushing passkeys, saying they're the best, and technically, yes, they are. But you've got to have good OPSEC, good device security, lock down those recovery options, not rely on SMS, make sure a simple SIM swap attack can't get recovery into those accounts. And I say a simple SIM swap attack because you may think, well, it's not that simple. I've got to get some fake ID, walk into a phone store, pretend I'm you, risk getting arrested and all of that. Well, yeah, that's one method, but there is another method. You can go to Telegram. There are certainly some services out there. I'm not going to put them in the show notes, but you can pay money and it's probably some rogue employee at T-Mobile or Verizon or whoever they may work for that's going to take a few $100s and they'll do the SIM swap attack for you within the company itself. And then, honestly, most sites also allow you just to bypass the passkey altogether. And I think that's certainly the case at the moment. People are getting used to it and they'll allow you to log in with an alternative method, such as a password or an email or whatever it may be. I am not a fan of them, which is why I stick with very long, complex, randomly generated passwords in KeePass. It's my offline password manager. I sync it with Nextcloud, which I run at home. I've talked about that in the previous season. I've got guides on the website of how to set that up, but there's no exposure to my Nextcloud server over the internet. It's completely local. And I like it that way. When I'm traveling, I have a local copy of my password vault in KeePass on my phone. I use Graphene OS, so it's KeePass DX on the Graphene OS phone. If you have an Apple device, I would recommend Strongbox, but it allows you to access that password manager locally. You've got the latest sync whenever you were last at home, and I think that's the safest option still for now. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. So a few weeks ago, I was looking at some independent stores. These are like family-owned mum and pop shops. I was looking for quite a specific item. Doesn't matter what it is, but anyway, I went to the website of one of them and I got what looked immediately like one of those Cloudflare verify you are human pages. It had a checkbox. It said check here to verify you are human. It looks exactly the same as what Cloudflare would present. And when you check that, it then comes up with another box saying verify you are human, verification steps. Step 1, open a terminal. It tells you to press Command and space and to type terminal. Step 2, it then says press Command and V to paste the verification code, which, by the way, when I check the verify you are human box, that will copy a malicious command to the clipboard. So if you were to do that, then you've just pasted this command and then it says press return to confirm. You will observe and agree, and then it's got some text. I am not a robot. Cloudflare ID, and it's got some random string of numbers. Well, this is called a ClickFix attack. It's a fake Cloudflare verification box that comes up, typically installed with a compromised WordPress plugin. WordPress, by the way, is the most horrendous way to run a website, especially in 2026. The last time I was running a website on WordPress was 2010, so 16 years ago. Now it just seems to be a honeypot for malware. I absolutely detest it. But anyway, had I gone through with those instructions, I would have indeed seen the I am not a robot message, but that's just an echo command. What the command is pasting to the clipboard, or what it's capturing in the website, is the echo command that says I am not a robot. And then it appends a curl command that points to a live domain. But they've done it in base 64. So you just get this base 64 string of characters, which, by the way, if you use my workbench page on the website, you can paste the base 64 into the output, and then you'll see on the input side the original URL. Now, typically what that does is install an infostealer on the device, which again, going back to storing passwords and passkeys in something like Google Chrome, that is a hot target for infostealers. They will often look for Google Chrome password databases. They will target those. Okay, let me just take a step back before I misspeak. Traditionally, infostealers have targeted Chrome and certainly other Chromium-based browsers because the profiles can contain databases holding passwords, but there's cookies, autofill data, and all sorts of other information, which is a treasure trove. Now, on Windows, at least, Chrome has historically encrypted these secrets using DPAPI, which protects them from another Windows user or perhaps someone reading the disk offline. But if there's malware already running on the machine as the logged in user, then they can just ask Windows to decrypt them. Now, I would say session cookies are also more valuable than passwords in this case because they allow the attacker to take over an already authenticated session without even needing to log in. If they can take that session cookie and steal that, then they're already logged in. They don't need MFA or anything else. Now, Chrome did introduce app-bound encryption, so there are protections in place against this, but why take the risk? Because there's probably some other method or a zero-day that hasn't been discovered yet. And the infostealer logs, which you can go to Tor, and there's also Telegram channels where you can find all these infostealer logs, and there are just hundreds a day. I will leave that there, what you consider they're used for. But these are infostealers such as MaxSync, S-Hub Stealer, Cuckoo Stealer, and various other payloads that these malicious captures or fake Cloudflare pages do install. What I want to discuss, though, is why these things have become so popular and so commonplace. Now, first off, you have many websites still hosted on WordPress, which is just dreadful. I don't like it. It's easy pickings for this type of attack. But secondly, the industry has normalized these recaptures and verify your human checkboxes. And if you use an always-on VPN, like I do, you're probably familiar with seeing this more often than if you were on just a residential IP address. And that's because, for whatever reason, the industry seems to have deemed anyone on a VPN as the bad guy, which is absolutely ridiculous. Now, there's two sides to it. I know why, because if I connect to, say, a San Jose Proton VPN server, then I'm sharing the same IP address with potentially hundreds of other people. So they cannot identify who it is necessarily using that server, not without logs. Proton don't store logs. That's the reason we use Proton VPN. But to Cloudflare or a service trying to detect if you are a bot or perhaps a malicious actor or genuine visitor, they're going to deem VPNs as suspicious. Okay, let's enter the mind of a threat actor for the moment. We want to do something malicious, whether it's ransomware or whatever it may be. We're going to steal someone's cryptocurrency. A VPN is probably going to go against us. It's already treated as suspicious. So we won't be able to log into the crypto exchange because it's going to flag as a suspicious connection, and it's going to prompt us for two-factor authentication. And there's all sorts of nonsense that you know if you use VPNs like I do that you're encountering almost every day. And actually, I make it sound worse than it is. I don't encounter too much problems. Once you're authenticated with these services, you're typically good. However, as a threat actor, you want to hide in plain sight. So what's the best way of conducting an attack? You want to use a residential IP address. You want to be using a Google Fiber connection in San Jose. I keep picking on that place, but that's like, seems to be the hub of hackers these days. But you do want to hide in plain sight. You want to use just a residential, regular internet connection, so you're not flagged as suspicious. And I think this is an area that has been overlooked and probably still is, but it's certainly nothing new. Residential proxies, or even a residential VPN, is something that would be highly valuable. They're very expensive and they're highly valuable to anyone wanting to do a ransomware or whatever it may be. And typically how they're obtained is through a number of methods. Now, again, we've got to put ourselves into the mind of the threat actor here. If you want to use someone's internet connection and you wanted actually a bot farm, you wanted hundreds, even thousands of them, how would you go about doing it? Well, certainly if I was a nation state, I may decide to sell these cheap digital thermostats that probably cost me $1 to manufacture in China, and I'll sell these on Amazon. They kind of work. They're a bit cheap, sell them for $10, $15, whatever it may be. And I'm probably going to make a loss if that's all I'm doing is manufacturing these thermostats. But what they're actually hiding inside is they need to connect to Wi-Fi. Once the user connects to Wi-Fi, I can now proxy via the device. That's number one. Set-top boxes and IPTV is another one. You may know that there's certainly other ways of watching various TV streaming services and premium channels than paying for a Hulu subscription or ESPN or Paramount or whatever these subscriptions are. I rarely watch TV, so I'm luckily outside of this camp. But these IPTV services, whether they cost you like $60 a year, whatever it may be, will pretty much give you access to every TV channel on the planet. So that's an excellent Trojan horse, isn't it? If you want to sell a device for someone just to plug into their TV and it's good to go. You've got a year's worth of free television, all the sports events, all the movies, everything on there. But guess what? That device is acting as a proxy. Which, by the way, if you are involved in IPTV, don't buy a device with it pre-installed. Build it yourself. There's probably guides out there. I'm not going to share any information on that. But yeah, just avoid these devices that are all pre-packaged because more than likely they are running a proxy or some sort of VPN server on there. And they're going to allow people to relay via your home IP address. So there's doorbells, smart thermostats, set-top boxes, probably CCTV cameras, home security systems. They're all going to have, let me rephrase that, they're not all going to have, but there are going to be malicious variants out there which allow for these residential proxies, which, as I said, are expensive. You may be able to charge $100 a month, $200 a month for a premium fast connection via a valid residential IP address. That is the real threat. But we can't go around blocking residential IP addresses. So the industry is really against a brick wall with this. They're still treating VPNs as suspicious, but seriously, the real criminals are not using Proton VPN to conduct a ransomware attack. Now, luckily, it's not just me saying this these days. There was actually a Wall Street Journal YouTube video, I'll link to it in the show notes, from about a month ago, which covered this exact problem with millions of consumer devices, especially the knockoffs, being infected by malware, and in particular, residential proxies. I think it's only a 10-minute video, so I'm not sure how informative it is, but still I'll share a link in the show notes if you're interested in that. But this leads on to a hypothesis I have, which is where the industry, in terms of cybersecurity defenders and Cloudflare and internet service providers, they clearly want to stop malicious traffic. And then you have governments, they want to see what everybody is doing. So we have consumers like you and I that want to protect our identity and protect ourselves. So we use an always-on VPN as well as all these other methods. But then you have governments that want to see what we are doing. Which leads me on to my hypothesis that this is just leading to more invasive ways of finding out who we are, which is where the UK proposed this multi-billion-dollar digital ID system, which I believe as of today, July 27th, I'm recording this, it has now been cancelled by this new government. Andy Burnham is the new Prime Minister, and I think that's been thrown out. Okay, and then in the United States, there's various states now that require age verification for certain websites, such as adult and gambling sites. This was a Supreme Court ruling in Texas. And the gambling sites do generally go further because the operators of these sites must verify identity, age and address, and sometimes social security numbers as well as physical location. But this is my concern over this. Once people get used to something appearing on the screen, so it used to be the Cloudflare, verify you are human, and now we have ClickFix malware attacks. If people are getting used to uploading their ID to prove their age, and they're becoming accustomed to uploading driving licenses and passports and doing facial recognition, what do you think the mind of a threat actor is going to do? Well, they will set up a fake site, a compromised WordPress plugin, a fake digital ID capture, and then steal the identity of legitimate consumers, because the industry is normalizing ID capture, bot verification, prove you're human, click on how many bags there are in the squares, where's the bike, all this nonsense. And it's always going to be used against the consumer. Whatever's doing the verification needs to retain as little information as possible. But I believe it's too late. We've already gone past that. It's becoming normalized to present ID, to gain access to things. Wasn't there a fear with Claude when Fable first came out? Then the Trump administration told them to take it down. And then there was this fear that to gain access to these more advanced frontier models, you would have to verify your identity. And then you know where that's going to go. You've got some private company doing identity verification. They get breached, and then all the driving licenses, all the passports are in the hands of the threat actor. So personally, I am on a mission, a campaign to get the cybersecurity industry, but I suppose everybody, aware of this. There are real risks about trying to verify someone via their identity or normalizing the upload of a Face ID or a passport, because it's always going to be used against us. And that's why we do what we do. We use VPNs, we use secure browsers, and we wear our tinfoil hats. Now, before we wrap up the show, I just want to thank you all for sticking around. I said it was the final episode last year. I've come back with season 2, and I am really grateful that I still have you all as listeners. Maybe a few have dropped out, but you are certainly a loyal bunch. Now, also, if you want to show your support for the podcast, you can head over to patreon.com/the lockdown. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. You're always welcome to join that community for free as well. But if you do want to show some support, then as always, I am incredibly grateful. Now, I'm not going to ask this every time, so I'm going to do it now and then I'll be done with it. But if you have access to an Apple device and you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts, hopefully a kind one, then I'll be really grateful for that as well. And finally, if you want to chat with me, but also the other listeners of the show. We have the Matrix community. The links to the Matrix community will always be in the show notes for every episode, so I won't read them out here. Now, I use Element. I highly recommend that, but you can use any client really. And Matrix is an open network for secure and decentralized communication. So what that means is you can join the community. We have a couple of rooms and a community space there, and it's been very active, although it did die down a bit since the podcast ended, but it's great to see there are some regulars still active in there. So let's bring back the Matrix community. If you want to join that, check out the show notes, install the Element client. I use Element X on Graphene OS, and you can use any client you like really, but it will be great to see you in there. And if you want to send in an email to the show, then you can email lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. So feel free to email if you've got any questions or any feedback for the show. For that, I will be grateful. And probably by the time you are listening to this, the Black Hat conference in Las Vegas is about to start. I will be there. So if you are around Black Hat and you want to meet and say hello, then no guarantees, but send an email or reach out in the Matrix community, and you never know, I might just be at a coffee shop nearby. And coming up in some future episodes, I have at least 2 guests that have verbally agreed at least to come on the show. So that I'm really excited about. They're not recorded yet. I'm actually meeting one of them during the Black Hat conference, but I'm definitely hoping to have more guests featured on the show. And one more thing, I haven't really mentioned it before, but the podcast is on YouTube as well. It's at Privacy Podcast. So if you go to youtube.com/@Privacy Podcast, I'm sure you can find it. It's great to see there are a lot of you joining in there. The more likes and subscribes, I suppose, I get on YouTube, the more it's going to be suggested, and the algorithm will probably be kinder to those interested in privacy and security. You're under no obligation to do that, of course, but whether you want to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, join Patreon, or just send me an email to say hello, all of that is great. Take care, and we'll speak soon.
Borderline, Spigot, Guitarist, Jawbone, Company, Tracker, Crossover, Spigot, Outfielder, Topmost, Impetus, Cubic, Bravado, Endow, Tomorrow, Ruffled, Impetus, Dropper, Reproduce.
Listen, just for kicks, let's entertain the possibility that it is a secret Russian transmission. Why would anyone talk like that unless they were trying to mask the true meaning of their message?
Exactly.
And why would anyone want to mask the true meaning of their message unless the message was somehow sensitive?
So how do we crack it?
Well, I guess we translate the rest, and hopefully a pattern emerges. It's probably going to take a super genius to crack it.